The refugee crisis in Europe in the 2010s. The refugee crisis in Europe in the 2010s was a humanitarian and political crisis that began in 2015 and continued through the end of the decade. The crisis was caused by a combination of factors, including war, persecution, and poverty in the Middle East and Africa. Millions of people were displaced and sought refuge in Europe, leading to a strain on European countries and a polarizing political debate. The crisis began in earnest in 2015, when a large number of refugees, mainly from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Eritrea, began to arrive in Europe by sea. The majority of refugees arrived in Greece and Italy, but many also arrived in other European countries such as Germany, Austria, and Sweden. The majority of refugees were fleeing war and persecution in their home countries. In Syria, a civil war had been raging since 2011, and the country was in the grip of a humanitarian crisis. In Afghanistan and Iraq, ongoing conflicts had displaced millions of people. In Eritrea, a dictatorship had been in place for decades, and human rights abuses were widespread. The refugee crisis put a strain on European countries, as they struggled to accommodate the large number of refugees. Many countries were ill-prepared for the crisis, and the number of refugees arriving overwhelmed their ability to provide shelter, food, and medical care. The crisis also put a strain on the European Union, EU, as the countries struggled to come to a consensus on how to deal with the crisis. Some countries, such as Germany and Sweden, took in large numbers of refugees, while other countries, such as Hungary and Poland, refused to take in any refugees at all. The EU was criticized for not taking a more coordinated approach to the crisis. The refugee crisis also led to a polarizing political debate in Europe. Some politicians and citizens welcomed the refugees and advocated for their rights, while others expressed concerns about the impact of the refugees on their countries and the EU. Populist and far-right politicians used the crisis to stoke fear and gain political support, arguing that the refugees pose a threat to national security and cultural identity. The crisis also led to human rights abuses, as refugees were often treated poorly, and many were detained in overcrowded and inhumane conditions. In some cases, refugees were forcibly returned to their home countries, where they faced persecution and violence. Efforts were made to address the crisis. The EU and other organizations provided aid and assistance to refugees and to the countries hosting them. The EU also made efforts to stem the flow of refugees, by working with other countries to improve conditions in the countries of origin and by implementing measures such as the EU-Turkey deal, which aimed to reduce the number of refugees crossing from Turkey to Greece. In conclusion, the refugee crisis in Europe in the 2010s was a humanitarian and political crisis that began in 2015 and continued through the end of the decade. The crisis was caused by a combination of factors, including war, persecution, and poverty in the Middle East and Africa, and led to the displacement of millions of people. The crisis put a strain on European countries and the EU, as they struggled to accommodate the large number of refugees and reach a consensus on how to deal with the crisis. The crisis also led to a polarizing political debate, with some politicians and citizens welcoming the refugees and advocating for their rights, while others expressed concerns about the impact of the refugees on their countries and the EU. Efforts were made to address the crisis, but the refugee crisis continues to be a significant challenge for Europe and the world.